And we begin this evening in India with one of the most notorious episodes in the history of British colonial rule in that country. It took place 100 years ago in the city of Amritsar in the Punjab region, now in northwest India. On the 13th of April 1919, a British officer ordered his troops to fire on an unarmed crowd, killing hundreds of them. It would become known as the Amritsar Massacre, or the Jallianwalla Bagh Massacre, named for the walled public space where it occurred. I'm joined now in studio by Kate O'Malley, historian and editor with the Royal Irish Academy's Documents on Irish Foreign Policy series. Kate, you're very welcome indeed to the programme. Just tell us about the state of Indian nationalism in 1919. I think something like 1.5 million Indian soldiers had been fighting in the First World War, so would have been slowly returning, presumably, to India at that stage. Was Gandhi, for example, living in India? What was the state? Was the Congress Party in existence?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting setup. So there's kind of a series of contradictions on the ground in India, if you will. So on the one hand, we have, a lot of those loyal returning officers, as you said. You also have some returning immigrants of the Gadarite variety, the Gadar meaning mutiny. These were Sikh radicals who, much like some Irish people during the war, sought the help of Germans in overthrowing British rule in India. They were coming primarily from Canada and America. So you have these returning to the scene as well. Gandhi returns too. And Gandhi at this stage was a social activist, I suppose is the best way to describe him. He was actively recruiting for the British during the war. And he came back to the scene, was interested in social activism in relation to kind of, mill workers, farmers, unfair treatment on the part of British administration there, but not necessarily active, and very much a moderate activist, not necessarily even a moderate nationalist at this stage. And then you have, from the British perspective, you have the announcement of a certain series of reforms, the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms. So you have on the one hand this moment of hope, I suppose, on the part of Indian activists, and then at the very same time you have the introduction of this very significant Rowlatt Act, right. And that's when everything kind of comes to this perfect storm, if you will.
We'll come to the Rowlatt Acts in just a minute or two, but you can imagine that Indians would have been expecting that there would be some quid pro quo, some reward for their enormous contribution to the British war effort in World War I.
Yeah, I suppose you could say that. And from there's so many Irish parallels when you look at it as well. But India always was kind of one step behind in relation to their requests, if you will. They would have been happier at this earlier stage with kind of more constrained constitutional developments, and then the British reaction to all of these kind of more subtler demands resulted in a backlash. So yeah, I suppose certain reforms were expected on the return. But then you also have this added complication of radicalism in Bengal as a result of the partition of Bengal in 1905, and instances of kind of acts of terrorism in Bengal too. So you get this sense from a British administrative point of view of things bubbling in the post-war period, and then from a wider British imperial perspective as well, I guess it's really important to look at 1919, or even the spring of 1919 in particular, and you're looking at the War of Independence breaking out here. You're looking at a revolution breaking out in Egypt, and then much more closer to home to the Punjab, you're looking at Afghanistan, and another Afghan war is in the offing too, with an anti-British Amir there. So there's a wider British imperial kind of geostrategic aspect to it as well.
So describe the increase in tension in the Punjab in 1919.
So what happens is you have the introduction of the Rowlatt Acts. This is really the extension of wartime legislation, if you will, primarily to account for...
Along the lines of what? The Defence of the Realm Act?
Yeah. There was a Defence of India Act on in wartime. So it would have allowed for
which gives the state enormous powers.
Sure, control of the press, arrest without trial, detention without trial. And like you said, when you look at this contradiction, when you have on the one hand constitutional reforms being announced, and then with the other this, you can understand why this is, especially political activists would have been very confused and quite irritated. But you have then Gandhi, who comes back with this new form of non-violence activism from South Africa, the Satyagraha, which means soul force, which is passive It is non-violent. And what he calls for in reaction to the Rowlett Act is a one day of, we would use the term strike or lockout, I suppose, but one day of fasting and prayer, very much passive, non-violent protest against the introduction of the Rowlett Act. So this is called Hartal. And this came in, this call happened in March. And it was, you think of the vastness of India then and indeed now. The way in which this was answered was, mixed. On the one hand, there was relatively successful strikes in Delhi, but it was very hard for Gandhi or indeed any of the other nationalist elite at this time to kind of keep control of this type of a movement when you have a kind of a growing momentum. So there is a result. As a result of some of these strikes, you get kind of, riots, looting and the likes of that. But in Punjab in particular, tensions are really high because Punjab is also, again, another contradiction, a recruiting ground for the British Indian Army. And then you have a lot of these returning Gather Sikhs as well. So Punjab, the British are very concerned about this bubbling, getting the better of them.
And at the back of their minds, obviously, was 1857, the Indian Mutiny. Obviously, it was not within immediate memory, but it certainly would have been in collective memory and in folk memory, and it would have been uppermost in the minds of British colonial administrators, I presume.
Absolutely, Myles. And in particular, Dyer himself, because Dyer was raised...
Now, tell me about Dyer. This is Brigadier General Reginald Dyer.
Yeah, Reginald Dyer, the British general in the Indian Army, who was a family were in India for many generations. In fact, so even though he was, for part of his time, schooled here, actually in Cork, he was British Indian, and so he would have had, very astute awareness of British history in India, and would have been infused with this memory of the 1857 First Indian War of Independence, as it's called, as well as the mutiny, and would have been raised, it has to be said, with in this kind of backdrop of racial hatred towards some of the radical Indian activists, and definitely ignorance of the growing Indian nationalist movement. So he really was at this particular time, I suppose, paranoid about the potential of another revolt on that scale. And lots of historians would argue that it's this kind of fear and paranoia that resulted in the actions. But it has to be said, you can't really look at his actions in Amritsar without viewing them through a racist prism.
And what about that old great British tradition of divide and rule? Why wasn't that working for them in the Punjab? Setting the Hindus and the Muslims at each other's throats?
Well, I suppose you've got the complicating factor of the Sikh community there too. It wasn't that straightforward. And one of the things that irked Dyer and O'Dwyer, who we might talk about in a little while as well, is the fact that there appeared to be on the ground this sense of actual working together on the part of the three religious communities there. And this was something that really struck fear in their minds, because this hadn't necessarily happened before. At least they weren't faced with it before.
OK, let's get on to the actual events of the day in question and the Amritsar Massacre. So Dyer is in Amritsar. There is a demonstration, a festival. No one quite knows exactly what it was or what it was supposed to be. Describe from his point of view, what he encountered.
So in the wake of Gandhi's call for Hartal or strike, there had been some looting and arson in the days in the lead up to April 13th in the area, and 5 Europeans were killed, and quite famously as well, although she wasn't killed, she was severely injured. An English missionary school teacher called Miss Shepherd had been attacked, and lots of people as well say that this was at the forefront of Dyer's mind, although I don't think it was. The famous crawling law was then brought into place, where any native quote unquote person passing the house that she was attacked in had to crawl on their hands and feet, and so you get this sense that Dyer is coming to the scene where Europeans have been attacked, everybody was under threat in the civil lines, and he was he had as well, it must be said, although it wasn't distributed effectively, said that gatherings now, there would be a curfew and political gatherings of any kind were banned. And so when he heard about this gathering in Jallianwalla Bagh of up to 20,000 people, he thought this was, something that had to be tackled. So himself and 50 soldiers went down to this enclosed square with repression in mind, it has to be said.
Let's hear his own words. This is how Brigadier General Reginald Dyer described the incident in his report on their return to base.
I entered the park by a very narrow lane, which necessitated my leaving my armoured cars behind. On entering, I saw a dense crowd estimated at about 5,000. A man on a raised platform addressing the audience and making gesticulations with his hands. I realised that my force was small and to hesitate might induce attack. I immediately opened fire and dispersed the crowd. I estimate that between 200 and 300 of the crowd were killed. My party fired 1,650 rounds. I returned to my headquarters about 1800 hours.
And those are the words of Brigadier General Reginald Dyer. You've actually been in this square where the massacre took place. Describe it to me.
The laneway, it's incredibly claustrophobic. I guess the best way to describe it would be if you think of, maybe Stephen's Green or Marion Square, but on a much larger scale, and it's kind of hemmed in by really large houses, and the only way up is this enclosed laneway with very tall walls either side that you would fit 2 to 3 people abreast walking up there. So it was kind of a shocking experience to go there knowing what had happened. I believe it's been changed and it's gotten a facelift since I was there a long time ago now in 2005. But the physicality of the location, it really just, it makes you wonder about the violence that was unleashed there and how he couldn't have but known there was nowhere to go. There was nowhere for the crowds to disperse. But also, having said that, they weren't told to disperse. They were not given any warning. And it was quite clear that they were unarmed, that they were peaceful, both protesters and people who had come from the surrounding areas. There was Baisakhi, which is a Sikh festival, a harvest festival going on there. So lots of these people would have never even thought that there was a coinciding political harthel going on or otherwise.
Little bit reminiscent of a massacre closer to home 100 years beforehand, the Peterloo massacre.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, Dyer is one person. There's an ODwyer, and the two are often mixed up. Michael O'Dwyer. Tell me about Michael O'Dwyer.
So Michael O'Dwyer was the Governor General of the Punjab, and he was an Irishman. He was a Catholic from County Tipperary, one of 14, but he came from a landowning family. And although, there's accounts of O'Dwyer, in his earlier time in India being looked upon favourably by local people because of his attitudes towards land reform and whatnot. In contrast to this, there's also the sense that his Irishness made him, all the more fierce in his loyalty towards the Crown and towards British India. And he, in particular, is quite unique in the sense that he initially supported Dyer and said that his action was, quote unquote, correct. But he didn't backtrack on this when the facts became apparent, and when the violence and the atrociousness of what happened became apparent to him, he still, supported his man.
What happened to Dyer?
So Dyer ultimately lost his job, but he didn't get any kind of form of punishment, if you will. And also, interestingly, he gained quite a lot of support back in Britain, where there was a lot of fundraising for his retirement and his case. I think the Morning Post had something like the subscription called the Defender of the Empire, and he got something like £26,000, an awful lot at that time, raised for his pension plan, if you will, quite unusual. So on the one hand as well, reaction to Dyer and to Jallianwalla Bay from a British perspective is interesting, because you have figures like Churchill, who quite famously is quoted as having said that the episode was without precedent and it was an extraordinary event. It was sinister and singular, and nothing like that had happened in the history of British imperialism, right? But then when you go on to see what Churchill does later on in his career in relation to India and the famine in particular in the Second World War, this is something that is quite contradictory, I think.
That Churchill quote re-emerged a few years back.
Yeah, it did indeed. I think David Cameron used it when he visited Amritsar in a visitor book. I could be wrong there, but I'm almost sure that's what happened, which I think is slightly insensitive on his part. But I think the risk of using this quote in particular of Churchill is that what has happened since in British imperial historiography and more generally is that when you look at it as this horrific, this monstrous, singular event, what you're really doing is, excuse the pun, you're whitewashing it. You know, so it hasn't really been addressed as adequately up until relatively recently by historians of British imperial history than it should have been. At least I think so.
In relation to O'Dwyer, somebody was waiting in the long grass for him.
Indeed, and this is you know an example of what goes around comes around. O'Dwyer then retires. He is in 1940 visiting Caxton Hall, where I think there was a meeting of the East India Association or something to that effect in his retirement. He was 75 years of age, going about his business. And Udham Singh was an Indian Sikh, by then radical, who had been in Jallianwalla Bay that day and had been injured, and he shot him and killed him. So this is how Michael O'Dwyer died. And I think it's interesting when you look at Gandhi in particular, who said of Dyer, just to kind of give you an idea of his sense of what happened in Amritsar, he said that we do not want to punish Dyer. We have no desire for revenge. We want to change the system that produced Dyer. And I think that's what we take from this, that although people would say that, you know, he was filled with this sense of paranoia and fear, really the British colonial system created Dyer, and he was a product of it.
Was it a pivotal moment in the way that Easter week in Dublin in 1916 was pivotal?
Absolutely. I mean, for many moderate nationalists, it was a turning point. Again, lots of 1916 parallels when you look at what happened in the wake of the executions here. Gandhi was no longer a moderate nationalist. Many more thousands were no longer moderate nationalists. And the non-cooperation campaign that happened in the 1920s quite simply wouldn't have happened if Amritsar hadn't.
Kate O'Malley, thanks for joining us on the History Show this evening to talk about the Amritsar Massacre of 100 years ago.